Hi everybody, Dan Illman along with Matt Bernier. Welcome to Breeders' Cup Focus. Each week here on DRF TV, we'll preview two major divisions for the Breeders' Cup. And this week, the biggest division of them all, it's the Classic. Let's take a look at the top contenders with odds by Daily Racing Form National Handicapper Mike Watchmaker. Obviously, preliminary odds. We've got Accelerate, the leading handicap horse in the country at 7-2. West Coast, the horse Accelerate vanquished last week at 5-1. And then we've got a couple of 3-year-olds, Catholic Boy and McKinsey at 8, Mind Your Biscuits, very versatile, also at 8-1, Mendelssohn and Thunder Snow at 10, Diversify coming off that disappointing effort in the Jockey Club Gold Cup at 12, Yoshida, a Grade 1 winner on Turf and Dirt at 15, and the Gritty Pavel at 20-1. Matt, let's start with last week's Awesome Again Stakes. It was the matchup between the top two morning line favorites on the Watchmaker line, Accelerate and West Coast. And West Coast was making his first start since the Dubai World Cup. He's down towards the inside. Accelerate lost ground throughout. And they're kind of just grinding home here with Accelerate getting the best of West Coast.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's going to look at this visually and say, oh, wow, spectacular preps leading into the Classic. But at the same time, you have to consider Accelerate carried a considerable amount of ground, and also what you alluded to with West Coast. This was his first start since running over in Dubai, so perhaps he needed one. I guess really the conundrum from a handicapper standpoint, they ran relatively slow in the grand scheme of things. Accelerate earned a 100, West Coast earned, I believe, a 97. They're going to need to run considerably faster than that in order to be legitimate contenders in the Classic. If you think Accelerate can get back to the 115 that he earned in the P Classic, he's obviously a major player. But if you think you're going to get something close to what we saw last Saturday, I think you owe it to yourself as a handicapper to start looking elsewhere.
Does it concern you that this was Accelerate's lowest buyer speed figure of the year, and the fact that uncharacteristically he was very anxious and fractious behind the gate? He just didn't seem to want to go in, and when the gates opened he was a little bit slow. Sometimes that's a sign of a horse going off form.
That to me was the first sort of real red flag when I was standing there watching it, seeing, wow, he doesn't want to load into the gate. That's never been him. Then once he's in the gate, he throws a little bit of a fit, and something that it may seem very minor, and I know a lot of people will roll their eyes when I talk about lead changes again, but when he broke, he began on his left lead for about the first eighth of a mile. And again, this is a horse that's usually very, very professional. Just things to me, if you're talking about 7-2 or 3-1 in the Classic, I think you owe it to yourself, again, just to at least explore alternatives.
But he's getting back to 1.25 miles. And remember when we said we didn't know if Accelerate would get 1.25 miles? In his last 3 races at 10 furlongs, he's won those races by a combined 21.25 lengths. As for West Coast, the logical excuse was it was his first start off a layoff. Bob Baffert has his eyes on the prize, that being the Breeders' Cup Classic. And the Awesome Again was just a good stepping stone to the Classic. No, it was not a fast race, but he did a lot of dirty work up front. He battled on gamely for second, and you got to think he's got a forward move in him second time off the bench.
Well, you would hope, if you like this horse, because that race isn't going to be good enough to get it done. Now, again, we talk about it. If you believe Baffert at face value, hearing that he was 80% and he needed a nice stiff race in order to get him ready to move up for a race at the Classic, then certainly this could all be reasonable to expect. But at the same time, let's be real. I mean, how often does Baffert bring a short horse back in a big race? It's still a Grade 1. It's not like they wanted to go out there and get embarrassed. He deserved to get tired. He had every right to at the end of the race. I guess I still wanted to see a little bit more, and there's also one other thing to keep in the back of your mind. You've heard Bob Baffert talk about it. A little bit of a virus going through his barn. Keep an eye on West Coast leading into a race like the Classic, and for that matter, everyone else in his barn, because last thing you need is to come down with a little bit of a cold leading into the biggest race of their careers.
Let's talk about a couple of 3-year-olds, the top 2 finishers of the Travers, Catholic Boy and Mendelssohn. We'll go back to the Travers right now, and it was a day and it was a race in which speed held up. You see Catholic Boy on the outside, now getting ahead in front of Mendelssohn, and he's going to go on and win comfortably by 4 lengths with a 104 buyer speed figure. Catholic Boy, like the older horse Yoshida, is very versatile, a Grade 1 winner this year on both turf and dirt. 1.25 miles really seems to be his friend, and on occasion we have seen some brilliant efforts from Catholic Boy. Is it a problem that his last 3 races have been sort of on the engine? Because there's got to be other speed in the Breeders' Cup Classic, especially if Diversify and Mendelssohn run again. This horse has shown the ability to rate and pass horses in the past. Is his sudden improvement recently due to the fact that they've gotten him on the lead?
Yeah, I think at least forwardly placed because I can't imagine him being outright on the lead in a race like the Classic. I think if Jonathan Thomas had it his way in a perfect world, you draw it up very similar to that Travers, where you sit just off of a target, you get first run on the deep closers. And by the way, I think that is really sort of a product. The fact that there was nobody running on from the back in the Travers, I think it's because the rest of the field wasn't very good. I think those top two, though, I think they happen to be the two speeds, and they happen to be both pretty talented. Catholic Boy, if you think that you're going to get a forward move, and he was flattered a little bit by Mendelssohn's performance in the Jockey Club Gold Cup last weekend, Catholic Boy all of a sudden becomes interesting. He's going to need a forward move, but I think 1.25 miles is his trip. And I said it going into the Travers. I wasn't totally convinced that dirt wasn't actually his preferred surface. I still am not totally convinced. I think this actually might be what he wants, the main track.
As for Mendelssohn, you mentioned his good effort in the Jockey Club Gold Cup. His first race against older horses, he pushed the speedy favorite Diversify, perhaps a little too hard through rapid fractions, and he ended up paying the price in the stretch. Still only beaten 2 lengths with a career-best triple-digit Beyer speed figure. But he's another horse, he likes to be forwardly placed, and this Classic should have at least a solid pace up front.
Well, really, it kind of comes down to Diversify. If he doesn't go, which personally I don't think Diversify should run in the Classic, after that, there's kind of a void of a true pace setter. And if you believe that to be the case, it's not out of the realm of possibilities that Mendelssohn finds himself on the front end. If you tell me that that's the case on the heels of the effort that we had in the Jockey Club, all of a sudden, you've got to look at him as a legitimate threat in here, too.
How good is McKinsey? We talked about West Coast. Getting a race off of the layoff, going into the Breeders' Cup in the second start of the form cycle. McKinsey was returning off a lengthy injury-induced layoff when he won the Pennsylvania Derby, and we're going to go back to that race right now. And he was very comfortable beating a solid horse in Axelrod. You saw him a little bit late to change leads, and he's going to flash his tail. That's what he does in just about all of his races. But it was nice to see this horse fire at 9 furlongs off of a long layoff. And listen, he probably still has some upside potential as a 3-year-old.
I think from a talent standpoint, you can make the argument that he is every bit as talented as any of the other 3-year-olds. I found it very peculiar following that race that Bob Baffert didn't immediately just say, of course we're going to go to the Classic. He also mentioned the Clark handicap. And really the thing that I'm sort of trying to read between the lines with, going into the Pennsylvania Derby, I wasn't convinced that 1 1/8 was necessarily McKinsey's friend. And when I hear Baffert say Classic or Clark, we'll wait and take a look, makes me wonder if they're not totally convinced that he's going to appreciate an extra 1/8 of a mile. I'll say this, from a talent standpoint, I think he fits in the Classic. If he runs there, I would be very, very concerned if I was a backer of his that final 1/8 of a mile he's going to come up and get a little bit tired.
Let's throw up those very preliminary watchmaker odds one more time, because there were 2 other important Classic preps last week that we should discuss. Mind Your Biscuits at 8-1 on the watchmaker preliminary line showed that 1 1/8 is within his scope. He's done just about everything in his career. A 2-time winner of the Dubai Golden Shaheen at 6 furlongs, just missed in the Met Mile at a flat mile, and last time out in the Lucas Classic, maybe it wasn't the strongest field in the world, but he can run a 108 Beyer speed figure and a very comfortable win. And I have a feeling that a lot of people are going to doubt whether this horse can get the 1 1/4 at Churchill Downs come Breeders' Cup time if he opts for the Classic. Are you one of those people?
You know what? Going into the Lucas Classic, I didn't necessarily love the idea of him going longer. But then again, when I go and watch the stretch run of that, and particularly the gallop out, I tell you what, I have a heck of a lot more confidence in him getting 10 furlongs than I do McKinsey. And if you believe that 108 Beyer, which there's no reason not to, it was off of a couple-month layoff. And keep in mind, he ran as well as he did in the Whitney when he was trying to chase down basically a loose on the lead Diversify over a sloppy track. I'm not totally convinced that we haven't seen the best from Mind Your Biscuits. Again, if you think 8-1 is a little bit light, that's your prerogative, but I think you have to look at him as a legit threat too.
Let's talk about that Jockey Club Gold Cup, won in shocking fashion by Discreet Lover at 45-1. The last run was the best run in the Jockey Club Gold Cup, considering the electric pace. Discreet Lover and Manny Franco made the last run, and they got all of the money. Thunder Snow was beaten the neck that day. I thought, all things considered, Thunder Snow got a good trip. He sat 3rd behind the dueling leaders. He made his bid. He took over, turning into the stretch. And yes, the last run was the best run, and he didn't make the last run. I was a little disappointed he didn't hold off Discreet Lover. No disrespect to the winner.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that point of view, but at the same time, I look at it and say this was his first start on dirt since the Dubai World Cup, and his return effort at York 2 starts back, let's call a spade a spade. It wasn't very good. He showed speed and then faded badly. to me, this, if you believe that there is a plan to get to the Classic and have him peak there, then you know what? This was in my opinion, a perfectly acceptable effort where he has taken a step forward. He's always going to be a little bit late with the lead change just because he's a European and he's not trained to do that. I think there is a realistic scenario where there's a forward move. You're right. From a trip standpoint, he got the ideal trip in that race in the Jockey Club. But at the same time, if you think he probably was one short of being at his peak, I don't see any reason why he can't take a step forward in the Classic.
Accelerate, the leader of the division. Not only according to Mike Watchmaker, according to most observers. He has had a sensational season as a 5-year-old. He is the 7-2 morning line favorite, preliminary morning line favorite on the Watchmaker odds. And it's an interesting Classic right now with older horses, 3-year-olds, horses that have run well overseas and on various surfaces. But right now, Accelerate is the one to down in the Classic.